Mr. Gellman, of course, is an incredible investigative reporter. I have read many of his articles in the Washington Post. I've followed his career since 1990. And he doesn't just write about vice presidents. Those of you who have followed him, you know he's written about everything from sports to the war in Iraq to Operation Desert Storm. Wherever there's been a story or where there has needed to be, a deeper delving into the facts, I think that's where you're going to find Mr. Gellman. It is an incredible pleasure for me to introduce him. And just before I do, I want to make one thought. I read your book, and in the book you refer to a Navy term called wardroom. I don't mean to embarrass you, but you spelled it as two different words, wardroom. Actually, it's one word, wardroom, and the derivation of that is that's where officers used to go to change their clothes. It was called the wardrobe room. So now I've given something back to you for this wonderful book that you provided me with, and it's my deep pleasure and honor to introduce to you Mr. Barton Gellman. Please welcome him.
I'm going to dedicate the second edition to you for that. Thank you. A few of you may be wondering why Angler? Why is this thing called Angler? That was Dick Cheney's Secret Service code name. Secret Service has a history of sort of a sense of humor about these things. They come up with a lot of names that have double meanings. So, of course, Dick Cheney loves fishing, and the name also gave me a lovely metaphor for the way that he has approached his job and the way he exercises power in Washington. And sort of no joke, there's an oblique quality to it in which he sort of comes from unexpected directions and winds up in unexpected places and likes to keep his role somewhat hidden. Now that a lot of people do know that about the Secret Service code names, a friend of mine said that if the Republicans win this election and McCain and Palin are in, that my next book should be called Antler. I don't know what her actual Secret Service code name is, but I have heard that her husband's name is Driller. I'm not making this up. So some of you may know that Angler began as a newspaper series in the Washington Post, and I figured that's 20,000 words. How hard can it be to fill it in a little bit and make a book? The thing was, I couldn't let go of the story. Cheney became kind of my white whale. He combines two qualities that make him sort of endlessly fascinating as a subject, which is power and mystery. Everyone keeps saying that he's the most influential vice president we've ever had, and yet no one can quite exactly describe what it is he's done. And there are a lot of theories about it, and there are a lot of myths about it. So I just kept reporting, and my publisher became more and more inclined to remind me about the deadline thing in the contract, which was a legal obligation of mine. So I blew the date by almost 3 months, which I hope will end up being good news for you, because it means that the last scene in the book takes you all the way up to July 4th of this year, 11 weeks ago or so, and now, it's sort of this physical object that's been manufactured and trucked all over the country, so they had to work pretty fast for that. And it also means that something like 3/4 of the book is new material, stories that I didn't know before or hadn't happened yet, or I didn't have room for the first time. So, Dick Cheney has been the nearest thing to a deputy president that this country has ever had. Angler, the book, does have a frame of reference. It has a point of view. It has a certain authorial voice that I can't use in the daily paper. But it's not fundamentally a political book. It's not a case for the prosecution or the defense. It doesn't have a lot of adjectives. I'm a storyteller. Angler is a narrative. The stories try to tell you something new, something you haven't heard before about Cheney, and more than tell you, show you. So the book is filled with scenes and descriptions of events, and I'll tell you about a few of those. What I'm going to do tonight, more than that, is I'm going to tell you some things that you won't find in the book. A friend of mine, Gene Robinson, who's a columnist, once said that students of public policy should be required to take a course called Cheney, just because of the man's facility for operating in government. And for some reason, that reminded me of the book that came out a few years ago called The Rules. Don't ask why, but you know, the one about how to find and keep a man, Dear Abby meets Machiavelli. Oh, don't laugh, that was a really big bestseller. So I've decided to repackage Angler as the Cheney rules. And for each rule, I'm going to read a short passage from the book that shows a little bit about how it works. Rule number 1, fly under the radar. So the first chapter of Angler tells the story of Cheney's selection as Bush's running mate in 2000. Cheney devised by far the most intrusive vetting system ever used in one of these searches, in which he asked questions that required potential running mates to disclose things you wouldn't tell your best friend, affairs, bad debts, cheating on exams, professional misconduct. There was a catch-all question that said, are you vulnerable to blackmail, and if so, how? Note to self, don't answer yes on one of those. A wise candidate would have withdrawn rather than fill that one in. And there's a sense in which it makes sense to do that to a degree. You don't want a blackmailable vice president. But the trick is that Cheney did not fill out his own questionnaire. So here's a passage that starts with a conversation I had with former Vice President Dan Quayle, who these days spends a lot of his time in a nice corner office on Park Avenue in New York. He went down through everybody's negatives, Quayle recalled, and everybody has negatives, and nobody really vetted him on what his negatives were. I asked Cheney's old friend David Gribben, who was vetting the other candidates, if he had looked over Cheney's records too. He replied, no, heaven and good grief, no. No one had access to Cheney's tax or corporate records, and no one but his own doctor read a word of his medical files. Cheney did not submit even his public speeches, interviews, testimony, and voting record. Dan Bartlett, then and later a top communications strategist for Bush, said Cheney set his heels against opening the books at Halliburton. Bartlett went to Bush and said, we're getting our asses kicked in the media because we're not prepared. Cheney wrote it out, and Bush went along. To his standard, he probably thinks he's an open book, Bartlett said. To his standard, trust me. Rule number 2. See rule number 1. Fly under the radar. So later in this same chapter, we find out that information, embarrassing information from the vetting file of one of Cheney's rivals, the governor of Oklahoma, Frank Keating, is leaked to Newsweek. The version that Newsweek gets is that Keating has a skeleton in his closet, that he accepted large gifts to pay for his children's college education and that he did not declare them. I'm going to take up where the book starts here now. In fact, Keating had reported the gifts and cleared them with federal ethics officers, but the gifts had not become public knowledge in Oklahoma, which has no such disclosure requirement. The Newsweek story touched off an explosion in Keating's home state. The legislature launched an investigation. Scores of local stories spoke of Keating's abandonment, even by his great friend George W. Bush. By the time reporters examined the federal ethics rulings, the biggest man in Oklahoma was political roadkill, crushed under wheels he never heard coming. No one caught a clear view of the driver. Rule number 3, this is related to rule number 1 in Keating's case: get out of Cheney's way. It obviously came from Dick Cheney or one of his people, Keating told me. To say that it was chicken shit, excuse the expression, is an understatement, he said. I mean, Dick Cheney coming into my life has been like a black cloud. The story did not go unnoticed in Washington. Keating made no public accusation, not until his interview for this book, but he hinted at his suspicion among friends. The rumor spread, and Keating thereby did the Vice President a favor he did not intend. He propagated the message, educational and just deniable enough: don't cross Cheney. The town was full of important people who had handed the Vice President their most personal files: John Kasich, Tom Ridge, Bill Frist, John Danforth, John Kyle, Chuck Hagel. Dick Cheney knows more about me than my mother, father, and wife, Frist told the Washington Post. Not, he added, that he was complaining or anything. Rule number 4. See rule number 3. Get out of Cheney's way. Paul O'Neill and other economic advisors, like Larry Lindsay, fought Cheney on some of his tax and spending plans. There's a guy named Ed Lazier, who may not be as familiar a name. He figured out rule number 4, and he got out of Cheney's way. And here's where the book picks up. This refers exactly to the ward room, or the wardroom, which is a small dining room in the White House for only the most senior executives. There was a weekly lunch that Cheney attended, and it was significant he attended this because vice presidents hadn't done that before, in which all the top economic advisors gathered once a week to talk strategy. So you had head of OMB, Treasury Secretary, Domestic Policy Council, National Economic Council, all these folks would have lunch and talk things over. It required a healthy dose of boldness for anyone at the table to press a disagreement too far. Cheney became, quote, a big time saver for us in that he takes off the table a lot of things that he knows are going to go nowhere, said Ed Lazier, who chaired the Council of Economic Advisors. Lazier, who ordinarily carried himself with the confidence of a man at the pinnacle of his profession, said he could not name a time when, quote, I have thought I was right and that the Vice President was wrong. Sometimes, he said, quote, I might fight for 10 minutes or so and, try to kind of argue with him, but it's clear by the time we've talked something through, I agree with him. I can't think of one case where he hasn't persuaded me. Rule number 5. Silence is powerful. If you want to understand Cheney's influence, you have to know how much he spooks people without even seeming to try. Stephen J. Hadley, who landed the Deputy National Security Advisor job under Condoleezza Rice, was another of Cheney's defense dogs, an informal group of Pentagon alumni. Like a lot of Cheney's employees, then and since, Hadley admired the man and found him unnerving in roughly equal measure. One day at the Pentagon, where Hadley served as an assistant secretary in the early 1990s, he emerged from Cheney's office and ran into his friend David Gribbin. Once again, he had briefed his boss and received little more than an inscrutable nod in reply. He told Gribbin, Cheney somehow intimidates me. He's not trying to intimidate me, but when I'm sitting there briefing him, I'm talking a little fast, and my voice gets a little high. Rule number 6. Never mind silence. Screaming is powerful. This scene begins the most extended and, I think, the most important narrative in the book. It takes up more than 2 whole chapters. And it describes what happens after the Justice Department comes to believe that the warrantless domestic surveillance program is not legal, or at least that parts of it are not legal. One day, a couple of lawyers from the National Security Agency drive down from Fort Meade, Maryland, the headquarters, and they come to the Justice Department to find out what all these questions are about. A burst of ferocity stunned the room into silence. No other word for it. The Vice President's attorney was shouting. "The President doesn't want this," he said. "You are not going to see the opinions. You are out of your lane." 5 government lawyers had gathered around a small conference table in the Justice Department Command Center. 4 were expected. David Addington got wind of the meeting and invited himself. This was going to be a very short meeting. "This is none of your business," Addington exploded. "This is the President's program." If Brenner and Potenza, that's the name of these 2 guys from the NSA, if they had replied with the auditor equivalent of, "You're not the boss of me," they would have been right. The 2 men could have pressed their document request and told the big, loud man from the White House to get out of their way. But that kind of thing did not happen often to an emissary of the Vice President, Addington least of all. The NSA lawyers returned to their car empty-handed. Rule number 7. When the Vice President calls, pick up the phone. Very early one morning, a voicemail indicator began to blink in room 6140 of the Interior Department. Sue Ellen Wooldridge played the message when she arrived. "This is Dick Cheney. I understand you're the person handling this Klamath situation, and I have some questions. Please call me at..." Long pause. "I guess I don't know my own number. I'm over at the White House." "Yeah, right. Who would fall for that?" Wooldridge, 40, was the 19th ranking official in a department that did not exactly bask in White House attention. "I thought to myself, someone is f***ing with me," Wooldridge said. She pressed star D on the keypad. Delete. Late that afternoon, Wooldridge returned from a meeting. Another message. Guy named Ron Christie from the White House, Cheney's deputy domestic policy advisor. "Any special reason," he asked, "why you're not returning the Vice President's call?" "Oh God, not a prank. Really sorry." Rule number 8. I can't disclose that one. All right. Rule number 8. Reach down. This is also actually illustrated in the same Wooldridge story. There are a lot more examples in the book. Cheney had a skill for finding out where in the bureaucracy a decision is going to be made, a pivot point for policy, long before it reaches the White House. And he would go straight there. And he knew that many decisions never reach even the assistant secretary level or the cabinet level, and certainly not the Oval Office. That if you can appoint the guy who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Interior for Fish and Wildlife, that enables you to have considerable influence over which species are put on the endangered list and which are taken off. And so when a minnow is getting in the way of your plans for diverting water in the Southwest, you can take the minnow out of your way. There's actually a whole chapter in the book which begins with the Wooldridge voicemail, in which Cheney actually changes the course of a river out west, and in doing so gets around endangered species laws, and the result is about 30,000 dead salmon in the largest man-made fish kill in recorded history. Rule number 9, know what you want. This is going to sound really obvious, but it's very powerful. Let's say you're here with some friends, and you have to pick a place to eat afterward. No giant dramatic affair of state in the balance, just, pizza or Chinese. Half of you are going to be on the fence. The thing about Cheney is he was never on the fence. Picking up from the book here, David Frum, one of Bush's speechwriters, said, quote, "There was a kind of aimless quality within the first year to the president's domestic policy agenda. There was nothing aimless then or ever about Cheney. There would be many reasons for Cheney's dominance in the Bush administration, some of them quite subtle. One was as simple as could be. The vice president knew what he wanted. Unlike most of his rivals, and unlike even the president he served, Cheney seldom indulged in ambivalence. Either he had a direction in mind, or he regarded the choice as unimportant and stepped aside." I'm going to add a rule on the fly here. Something that we said back in the green room reminded me of it. So if you'll forgive me, I will go find page 328. It complements know what you want rule. It's know what you don't want. This begins just after Hurricane Katrina strikes the Gulf Coast. As you know, Scott McClellan in his recent book has said that the mishandling of that was the undoing of Bush's second term. That was essentially the end of Bush's ambition to get anything done in the second term. What he did not describe, I guess I'll start reading now, what he did not describe was Cheney's role, or more aptly, his disinclination to play one. Days after the storm had passed, when he finally returned to Washington from Crawford, Bush assembled his senior staff in the Oval Office. He was going to form a cabinet-level task force, he said. Quote, "I asked Dick if he'd be interested in spearheading this," Bush announced. "Let's just say I didn't get the most positive response." Bush nodded ironically toward the vice president, putting on a show for the others. Card, Rove, Bartlett, Condi Rice. His expression, the tone of his voice, had a hint of edge. Can you believe this guy? Anyone who had FaceTime with Bush said he was smarter than the public believed and meaner. He spared Cheney the thunderbolts. Rove got the worst of them when Bush was in a mood to yell, but now and then aides saw the president give Cheney the back of his hand. Will you at least do a fact-finding trip for us?" Bush said. "That'll probably be the extent of it, Mr. President, unless you order otherwise," Cheney replied. He was the Cheshire cat inverted, only the smile dissolving, the rest of him still in the chair. I guess that was 9A, because the next one is 10. Rule number 10, truth is like fiction. Cheney's wife, Lynn, I think you know, is a novelist. One of her novels reads more or less like a guidebook to the last 8 years. Picking up from the book, Lynn Cheney's Executive Privilege, published in 1979, that's the title, Executive Privilege, stars a heroic president from out west, Montana, not Wyoming, brisk and businesslike and principled. An entertaining subplot involves the scheming number 2, angling to make the vice presidency more important. That's a quote. President Zern Jenner lies unapologetically to protect a foreign policy objective, regime change. More important, he says he is protecting the prerogatives of the office itself. Jenner, say it fast, and it sounds a little familiar, is a barely camouflaged stand-in for Cheney. The plot itself is a stand-in for Cheney family values. In one scene, a top aide to the president praises martial law tribunals for terrorists 22 years before the September 11th attacks. The bad guys are mostly reporters. They are disrespectful and inclined to unkempt dress and a slouching demeanor. They lie, sleep with their sources, and steal documents off unguarded desks. The number 1 villain in the book, wait for it, writes for the Washington Post. Rule number 11. Fiction is like truth, also known as you can't handle the truth. The vice president leaned over a coffee table, unrolling secret documents across the top. He had an audience of one. Dick Armey, the House Majority Leader, saw no need for a scrap with Saddam Hussein. In the privacy of his office, for this one crucial vote, Cheney leveled claims that crossed so far beyond the known universe of fact that they were simply without foundation. The vice president brought the disquieting news that Iraq's, quote, ability to miniaturize weapons of mass destruction, particularly nuclear, had been, quote, substantially refined since the first Gulf War, Armey recalled. Armey spoke on the record to me for this book. He's been holding this story for a long time. It was the suitcase nuke scenario, the ultimate nightmare. Why had Armey not heard about this from George Tenet? According to Armey, Cheney also reported that al-Qaeda was, quote, working with Saddam Hussein and members of his family. What that meant, Cheney said, was that we now know they have the ability to develop these weapons in a very portable fashion, and they have a delivery system in their relationship with al-Qaeda. Now, I skipped some parts here. Eventually, Armey learns that the CIA had no intelligence to support those claims. Really none at all. And this is different from the debate we've been having all these years about whether Cheney exaggerated or misstated the evidence in public, because the question there was, did he knowingly cherry-pick evidence? Did he rely on unverified intelligence? Did he exaggerate the degree of certainty, and so on? Here, he's telling Armey something that simply wasn't true. And it's not by accident. This is sort of one of those hinge of history moments, because what was at stake was the Congressional War Resolution. And I want you to try to think about what would have happened had the House Republican Majority Leader, a man from Texas with a nearly perfect conservative voting record, had stood up and said, I'm against this war and I vote no. He would have given tremendous political cover to every doubter, and especially to Democrats who feared being attacked as weak a year after September 11th. Armey told me elsewhere in the chapter, this whole story is recounted at some length, that if he'd known then what he knows now, he would have voted against, and he believes he could have stopped the resolution. He doesn't say he believes he could have stopped the war, and I personally doubt that. I think he probably could have stopped a yes vote, but I think there never would have been a no vote, because I think they would have taken the resolution off the floor, and Bush would have, he would have acted on his own inherent authority as commander-in-chief as he saw it. But here's what Armey said to me, sort of looking back at the episode. He said, if you'll pardon the Texas vernacular, I felt like I deserved better from Cheney than to be bullshitted by him. Rule number 12. This goes with rule number 3, get out of the vice president's way. This rule is, if you're angry at Cheney, kick someone else. The second or third time Cheney blindsided Rice and Powell, the two of them decided to send a message. They synchronized an appearance in the White House to lodge a complaint with Al Gonzalez. Powell at her side, Rice blazed with anger. There will be no more secret opinions on international and national security law, she commanded. If it happened again, she would go straight to the president. Powell remarked admiringly as they emerged that Rice dressed down Gonzalez, quote, in full Nurse Ratched mode. He had just compared the national security advisor to the head nurse in the 1975 film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which happened to be set, a colleague observed afterward, in a mental hospital. No one believed poor Fredo was in charge of the decision to exclude Rice and Powell, but neither of them raised a ruckus with the vice president or even with Addington. When it came to Cheney, Rice's voice, like Nurse Ratched's late in the movie, was choked to a whisper. Rule number 13, know thine enemy. This scene begins after Abu Ghraib, The senior national security lawyer in the White House, who was Rice's advisor for all things that touched on diplomacy or defense issues or intelligence, sees that the Abu Ghraib disclosures are a huge disaster on so many different levels. And his advice is that the president needs immediately to demonstrate that he considers this to be an outrage, to distance himself from it, and to demand explanations. And so he composes a very frank memo to Rice, very bluntly saying that he actually drafts out the language that Bush should use, which will hold Rumsfeld to account, demand an explanation, and a plan of action within 30 days. Now, Cheney, who is Rumsfeld's old friend, does not think highly of that advice, and here's where the book picks up. And then Bellinger found out something that in 3 years as a top advisor to Rice, he had never known. Every time he wrote a memo to his boss, a blind copy was routed to the vice president's office. Libby, according to one official, had made the arrangement with Steve Hadley, Rice's deputy. It was not advertised, and neither was it reciprocated. What happened in Cheney's office stayed in Cheney's office. Rule number 14, really know thine enemy. How dare he? This is illegal, Eric Edelman said, looking up from a stack of stabled intelligence traffic from the National Security Agency. He has no instructions to do that. What are we going to do about it? Edelman was Cheney's principal deputy national security advisor. What he was reading, according to a colleague, was the NSA transcript of an American diplomat's conversation in the Persian Gulf. Richard Haas, the State Department's director of policy planning, was in Abu Dhabi. He had been battling the Pentagon and the vice president's office in a tug of war over engagement with Iran. Cheney and Rumsfeld backed strict isolation in order to undermine the regime. Like other senior officials, Edelman received daily transcripts from the NSA. Ordinarily, when eavesdropping on Americans abroad, the agency removed their names from the transcript. But policymakers could obtain a name by special request. The vice president's office took advantage of that prerogative. At the United Nations, U.S. diplomat Hilary Mann was authorized to speak to her Iranian counterpart, Khoresh Ahmadi, about Afghan issues. One day, a friend at the State Department warned her that her meetings, too, were monitored. Be careful, the friend warned, alluding vaguely to high-ranking figures in the White House. Your name is coming up in intercepts. Protect yourself. Rule number 15. Winning is easy when the other side doesn't know that there's a game. Cheney used to talk a lot about process, about making sure decisions were carefully vetted. I got hold of some notes that James Baker took in 1980 when Baker was about to become Ronald Reagan's chief of staff. Cheney had been chief of staff, of course, to President Gerald Ford, and so he gave the advice, and Baker's notes only once in 4 pages come in all capital letters, presumably reflecting great emphasis from Cheney, and the 2 lines are, be an honest broker, don't use the process to impose your policy views on Prez. Now that's not how it worked when Cheney persuaded Bush to reverse a campaign promise to regulate carbon dioxide as a pollutant. Christy Whitman at the EPA sensed there was trouble. And now I go to the book. Bush had said when he hired her, if you ever need to talk to me directly, just blow away the palace guard. On Friday, 5 weeks into the job, Whitman phoned for an appointment. Bush's schedulers slotted Whitman for 10 a.m. the following Tuesday. She spent the weekend honing a set of short, sharp talking points. Cheney, who saw the president's calendar in advance, had plenty of time to preempt her. Whitman's meeting did not last long. Cheney had already been and gone, Bush's signature in hand. As a dispirited Whitman left the Oval Office, Cheney walked briskly past in an overcoat, heading for the weekly Senate Republican lunch. Do you have it? The vice president asked to an aide who passed him an envelope. The vice president was taking no chances. He would deliver Bush's letter by hand. By afternoon, the president of the United States had aligned himself with fringe group claims that the causes and significance of global warming remained unproved. Rule number 16, hypothetical questions aren't. This is the story of how warrantless domestic surveillance began when Cheney summoned the NSA director, Michael Hayden, just after September 11th. Outsiders spoke of wiretapping, but agency employees had a saying, outsiders don't know SIGINT from Shinola. Telephone calls were one thin slice of the electromagnetic spectrum. If information flew on a photon, the agency tried to catch it, microwave or radio wave, visible light or infrared light or laser. Headquartered on a 5,000-acre campus at Fort Meade, Maryland, the NSA could aim its globe-spanning apparatus anywhere, in or out of U.S. territory. It could, but it did not. Cheney asked George Tenet to find out what the NSA might do differently if unleashed. Michael Hayden, its director, came back with a Venn diagram, 3 ovals drawn with overlapping edges. One oval represented the spy master's ideal, everything desirable that signals intelligence might provide. A second showed what could be done with present technology. The third oval included only what was legal. The agency, Hayden told the vice president, worked inside the space where, quote, all 3 of those ovals intersect. The vice president looked at Hayden's 3 ovals, desirable, possible, legal. Set aside the third one, Cheney said. What could you accomplish if you stopped closing your eyes and ears to communications inside the United States? Rule number 17, watch the boss's diet. In this story, John Ashcroft finds out that Cheney is leading a process that's going to create military commissions to try terrorists. And in fact, most of the US government, most of the relevant agencies don't know that that's what's about to reach the president. There's a parallel process going on under the leadership of Colin Powell at the State Department, and it's got representatives from Justice and military services and all the relevant agencies. They're considering a lot of options, but Cheney knows what he wants. He wants military commissions, and he's getting ready to bring that to the president. Ashcroft hears about it, more or less by happenstance, and he demands a meeting. He shows up in the Roosevelt room, and Cheney is waiting at the table. It was difficult to tell what the president knew, if anything, about the military order now heading toward his lunch table. Certainly, he approved the idea that this was going to be a new kind of war, without a lot of lawyerly coddling for terrorists. When details became important, someone was supposed to tell him. Was he aware of Ashcroft's objections? Did Bush intend to keep his national security advisor and Secretary of State out of the loop? Jack Marsh, an old friend and colleague, said that Cheney believed, quote, you get off the president's plate everything that you can. When Cheney cared about an issue, he did what he did with barbecue when Lynn wasn't looking. He piled his own plate high. Every administration struggled with this question. The president should not be asked to decide questions below his pay grade, but he had to know enough to decide when he wanted to intervene. Ashcroft could have walked a few yards down the hall. He was not close to Bush, but the Attorney General got an appointment when he asked. How many times did a cabinet officer want to dip into that well? Ashcroft turned left at the door from the Roosevelt room, away from the Oval Office, and back out onto the street. Rule number 18. It's kind of the converse of get out of the vice president's way. If you're going to fight the vice president, don't hold back. James Comey and Jack Goldsmith at Justice, who were the number 2 and number 5 ranking officials, respectively, told Cheney that they did not believe the domestic surveillance program was legal. And this is, as everyone knows, at the time when John Ashcroft is in the hospital with acute gallstone pancreatitis, and he's in very bad shape in intensive care. So Comey's the acting Attorney General. Cheney called a meeting to change their minds. And picking up now, the staging had been arranged for maximum impact. Cheney sat at the head of Andy Card's rectangular table, pivoting left to face the acting Attorney General. The two men were close enough to touch. This program, Cheney said, was vital. Turning it off would leave us blind. It would be a profound mistake. How can you possibly be reversing course after all this time on something of this importance, Cheney asked. Comey held his ground. I will accept, he said, for purposes of discussion, that it is as valuable as you say it is. That only makes this more painful. If I can't find a lawful basis for something, you're telling me you really, really need to do it, doesn't help. Others see it differently, Cheney said. There was only one of those, really. John Yoo had been out of the picture for nearly a year. Now it was all Addington. The analysis is flawed, in fact, facially flawed, Comey said. That's lawyer speak for on its face, it was flawed. No lawyer reading that could reasonably rely on it. Gonzalez said nothing. Addington stood by the window over Cheney's shoulder. He had heard a bellyful. Well, I'm a lawyer, and I did, Addington said, glaring at Comey. No good lawyer, Comey said. Rule number 19. George Bush really is the decider. And I mean that quite sincerely. There are lots of examples in the book in which Bush overrules Cheney or veers off his course or chooses not to pursue an initiative that Cheney recommends. If you read this book, you will see that Cheney was enormously influential and powerful, but this was not a Cheney administration. But before Bush could say no to Cheney, he did have to find out what the VP was doing. Cheney spent 3 months trying to suppress this Justice Department rebellion. Bush did not find out until he called Comey into his private dining room on March 12, 2004. And I described that scene in some detail. Each of them gets a huge surprise in that conversation. Bush's tone grew crisp. I decide what the law is for the executive branch, he said. That's absolutely true, sir, you do. But I decide what the Department of Justice can certify to and can't certify to, Comey replied. Now Bush said something that floored the acting Attorney General. I just wish you weren't raising this at the last minute. The last minute? He didn't know. The president said a few more words, not the way it's supposed to work, popping up with news like this. Day before a deadline? Wednesday. He didn't know till Wednesday. No wonder he sent Card and Gonzalez to the hospital. Oh, Mr. President, if you've been told that, you have been very poorly served by your advisors, Comey said. Comey was edging toward a breach of his rule against resignation threats. You resign or you don't. He had already decided. The problem, he told friends afterward, was that he could no longer assume the president had made an informed decision. This man just needs to know what's about to happen. Comey blurted out, I think you should know that Director Mueller of the FBI is going to resign today. Bush raised both eyebrows. He shifted in his chair. He could not hide it, or did not try. He was gobsmacked. And the aftermath of this story is that Bush calls Mueller, who's waiting for Comey down outside the Situation Room, who calls Mueller up to the office and says, is this true? And Mueller says, yes, it's true. And Bush says, no mas. Bush completely reverses course. Bush does an about-face 24 hours after having signed an order. And I can't overstate the significance of that, both for Bush, because this happened in mid-2004, and his own advisors told me on the record that he would have been a one-term president, had a mass exodus taking place from his Justice Department and FBI. But also, I think, for the history of the presidency, I'm unable to come up with another example in which a wartime president overruled his advisors, said something of maximum importance was going to happen whether they liked it or not, and less than a day later caved in because they said they would resign. There have been resignations before, and there have been threats before, but it's never happened quite like this. I think historians will be looking carefully at that for a lot of years to come. Rule number 20. And this one's almost what Tom Hanks said in that movie, A League of Their Own. Rule is, there's no crying in the Situation Room. This story begins when Bush issues an order. There will be trials at Guantanamo Bay, and they will start by the end of January. Cheney and Rumsfeld don't like the idea. This is the story of how they frustrate efforts by Condi Rice to reach a decision on how those trials will move forward. Rumsfeld finally said yes to a meeting on January 29th, 2 days before Bush's deadline. At the appointed hour, Rice took the head of the long mahogany table in the Situation Room. Cheney usually took the seat to her right, but Rice did not see him today. Along the right side of the table, in black leather swivel chairs, instead sat Andy Card, John Ashcroft, and George Tenet. To Rice's left were Colin Powell and Air Force General Richard Myers, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Between them, looking sheepish in Rumsfeld's seat, was his deputy, Paul Wolfowitz. "Where's the secretary?" Rice asked. "He's unavailable," Wolfowitz said. Rice picked up her papers. "We're not going to have this meeting. We're going to reschedule this for a date in the next week, and the principals will be present," she said. It took 2 weeks. Same room, same cast. Same question, same answer. Rumsfeld was unavailable. Rice marched out and sent a memo, not so much an invitation as a demand. The principals would gather on Wednesday, February 25th, 2004. They were running a full month now behind Bush's deadline. The day arrived. The group filed in. Hadley, Card, Ashcroft, Powell, Tenet, Myers, Wolfowitz. "Where's the secretary?" Rice demanded. Wolfowitz looked as though he would rather be in that other place, or anywhere. "Unavailable," Wolfowitz said. Tenet stood up, pushing back his chair a little harder than strictly required. "There are several doors to the Situation Room. One was just behind him." "This is bullshit," he said. "I'm out of here." "George, do not leave this room," Rice commanded. "This is bullshit," Tenet pronounced, more emphatic. He took a couple of steps and he was gone. Something happened to Rice's face, control melting away. Her eyes welled up, and her next words caught in her throat. The men in the room did not know where to look. "She started to cry," said one of them, and she said, I can't remember the exact words because I was so shaken. She said something like, "We will talk about this again," and she turned and walked quickly out the door. Now, I'm not walking out, but I think I'm out of time for my initial remarks, so I'm going to open the floor to questions. If after tonight you still have more questions and even your 2 copies of the book don't answer them, feel free to look me up on bartongellman.com. I've got an email address on there and I do answer them. Okay, well, we have 2 people asking a question. Is there any chance that Cheney can be brought up on war crimes before the International Court? I'm not a lawyer. I don't play one on TV. I think there, in terms of U.S. law, there would be significant constitutional issues involved in having one branch bring criminal charges against another branch other than in an impeachment trial, which is the way the Constitution says to do it. I don't see any likelihood of impeachment. I think that what I can tell you that's empirical, sort of observed and reported fact in the book, instead of me speculating, is that there were a number of people in Cheney's office and allied with Cheney's office who were worried about criminal exposure for people who were involved in the interrogation program and for people who were worried about, and for people who were involved in the warrantless domestic surveillance. Now, I stress that they believed, David Addington believed that what he was doing was legal and proper and necessary. But he said to one of his colleagues, there's a scene in the book where he says, "I'm sure that after we leave, we'll all be hauled up before grand juries and congressional committees. And the way he continued that thought was he said, I am not going to bother hiring a lawyer. I'm going to go there and tell them myself that what we did was right. Nevertheless, he and others laid down as thick a blanket as they could of legal protection and immunity in various rules, legislation, executive orders. Some people who are lawyers would speak of this as an ex ante pardon. The idea that if you rely on the president's order, you are immunized in advance from any later accusation that what you did was a crime. Let's see. What has Cheney's reaction to the book been like? How many times have you spoken to Cheney himself? Take the second one first. Cheney did not talk to me for the book. I have spoken to Cheney quite a few times back when he was defense secretary, because I covered him then. And in those days, his interaction with the mainstream media was, much more relaxed. He still didn't say anything he didn't want to say. He stayed on message very well with great discipline, but he's a funny guy. He can be quite charming. He is, look, people who don't like what he's done in office want to believe that just sort of across the board and by every sort of measure of human behavior, he's a monster, and he's not. He's much more gracious, for example, than Al Gore is when it comes to things like you're running a little late and your drivers and Secret Service detail are standing outside in the snow so they can open the door for you at any second. Cheney will walk outside in the snow and say, we're going to be another 15 minutes. And some of the Secret Service guys told me that Al Gore never would have done a thing like that. He can be, as I say, very gracious, friendly on a personal level, and if you get in his way on a professional level, you stand between him and an objective, he's going to go around you or he's going to go through you. So I used to talk to him a lot when he would travel overseas. A lot of times he had to stop to refuel in the Secretary of Defense's aircraft, and the refueling often happened in Shannon, Ireland. There's a really nice bar there in the waiting area with good Irish stout, and he would come out and order a half pint and sort of shoot the breeze with the reporters. And of course he drank about 2 sips and put it down. Control was very big in the Cheney world view. So no, I did not talk to him for this book. I talked to hundreds of people who had direct contact with him or members of his staff. I talked to a lot of people who are admirers and colleagues of his. I talked to a lot of people who started out that way and kind of made a turn along the path. And I talked to a lot of people who hated everything he'd done and had battled him and usually come out victims. I spent a lot of time, often successfully, persuading people to go on the record. And so you have people, just say on the Justice Department, meltdown story. Jim Comey has never spoken before except in testimony in Congress, and he would not answer any of the questions in Congress that I wanted to answer in this book. He gave me a long on-the-record interview. I have a copy of his resignation letter. I have an email that he wrote immediately after leaving the president's office telling 6 colleagues what had just happened on that Friday morning. Talked to Andy Card and Connie Rice, and Steve Hadley, Josh Bolton, Karl Rove, John Ashcroft, and a lot of people who I can't name, to try to get a picture of what had happened. And wherever possible, I had records to support that. And since I know that readers are going to ask, how could you possibly know what you just wrote here in this passage? For the really dedicated, there are 70 pages of endnotes that take you page by page and tell you what, as transparently as I'm able to do, how I know what I purport to know in the book. As far as Cheney's reaction to the book, I have no idea. I do know that the series we published in the Washington Post 15 months ago, it was maybe counterintuitive what his reaction is, but if you listen carefully to the Cheney rules, it won't surprise you. He liked it. He did not think I was trying to do him any favors, I or my partner in that series, Joe Becker, but he was just sliding in toward that lame duck final period of an administration, and anything that made him look really tough could only help. In a McCain administration, would Cheney have a role? Only over McCain's dead body. It's startling to see how much Cheney became in this election campaign a punchline, actually. In Republican debates, I went back through all the transcripts and I watched a few of the clips of the good parts for me. Many of the candidates were asked more than once, what kind of vice president do you want? What do you think of this Cheney model? Do you want a vice president as powerful as Cheney? In one of the debates, there was you know how they were submitting questions from YouTube and so on. There was an animated Cheney asking, what about the vice president? Will the vice president be important? And McCain's answer, he started off with a joke. He said that the job of a vice president is to cast tie-breaking votes in the Senate and to inquire daily into the health of the president. Now, it's actually not so much, that's literally what the job of the vice president is in the Constitution. And after everyone stopped laughing, he said, I want you to know there's going to be no mistake about who the president is. Huge applause line, Republican audience. In other debates, candidates were asked about Cheney or about the vice president, and the audience started laughing before the question even finished. Look who wants to mention Dick Cheney's name in the general election campaign now, and who doesn't. But beyond that, on a political level, McCain and Cheney battled quite often in this administration. They dislike each other quite a bit, and they disagree pretty profoundly on issues involving interrogation in terms of on executive authority. And McCain said a few months ago that Bush listened too closely to Cheney and that Cheney had led to disaster in Iraq. It wasn't that he was against the war, he was against the way the war was managed, and he think that Cheney had a bad influence in this. So, and one last little piece of evidence here is that Liz Cheney, the vice president's older daughter, and kind of the id that speaks aloud because she says a lot of things that he won't say. She went on national television and said that it would be bad for the country if McCain were elected. That's what she was supporting, first Fred Thompson and then Romney, but now she's not saying anything at all. Thank you very much.